All right, Gary, we see your slides, and if you want to hit the presenter view, you should be ready to go.
Okay, there we go. Can you see full presentation, Matt?
It's not in full presentation mode.
Oh,
If you go up, yeah, hit that from beginning button.
Okay,
Perfect.
there. Okay, super. Thanks, Matt. And thank you for joining us today. Tyler Carlson, we recorded his presentation a couple days ago, and actually he's got a great presentation that's a standalone that we'll have later on the SFA website as well as our extension website. So thank you for joining us today. Silvopasture in Minnesota. So these are kind of our lead agencies that are working in Silvopasture, the Sustainable Farming Association with Tyler and his staff. Then NRCS and SWCDs also in the state are working with us on promoting silvopasture. First of all, I wanted to say what the 5 practices of agroforestry are, which is one is silvopasture. It's the intentional combining of agriculture and working trees to create sustainable farming systems. Forest farming, windbreaks, alley cropping, riparian forest buffers are also the other 4 that are 5 practices in agroforestry. Obviously, in Minnesota, we probably have the most in windbreaks, but certainly silvopasture and riparian forest buffers are really a major part of agroforestry in Minnesota. And actually coming on is forest farming with shiitake mushrooms and different leeks and so forth, ramps in the woods and so forth. So in Minnesota, we have a lot of producers that are unmanaged woodland grazing. And that's the audiences that we're trying to reach out for, that have woodlands and that have cattle or other livestock that are grazing them and not managing them properly. So that's the key educational component for silvopasture in Minnesota. So history, the agroforestry and silvopasture is not new in the world. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years. Here's the Dehesa silvopasture system in Spain, where they have oak trees and cork trees. And I think actually they graze hogs and cattle in these environments, and they sell them at premium prices. The oak and the meat and so forth is sold at premium prices for hams and different things like that. So the 3 practices of silvopasture, you're managing 3 major resources. So you're managing livestock, they're grazing. You're managing the forage or understory plants for the forage, and then you're managing the trees in the upper story. So we usually like to see about 50% shade to sun, and in some environments, 75% more sun would give you more vegetation underneath the canopy of the trees. But we're trying to look at high value trees that could be marketed in later years, and then obviously managing livestock that are usually sold on an annual or biannual basis. So why silvopasture now? I think we're noticing a lot of advancements and people are ready. Partners are ready and promoting silvopasture, like the Sustainable Farming Association, SWCD, Soil Water Conservation Service, also the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Those types of state and federal agencies are supporting landowners in cost share programs and equip programs that are funding these practices, and farmers are ready to change into a more sustainable grazing system. So our collaborators, again, the Sustainable Farming Association, Great River Greening is a restoration type organization that's been very supportive of our Oak Savanna grant, Oak Savanna through restoration through silvopasture that we've had from LCCMR for the past couple of years. SWCDs, NRCS organizations around the state have been very supportive as well as extension. So in recent years, the Minnesota SWCD has a resolution to support silvopasture in supporting NRCS programs such as EQUIP and other programs that they have through the federal government. And that's really a dynamite situation where each county has SWCD and NRCS offices that work with farmers that want to do these types of conservation practices and agroforestry practices. There's a separate NRCS practice for silvopasture 381, and you can ask your county NRCS office about that. Also, there's other programs in the NRCS practice repertoire that can benefit farmers as well. So you can have individual practices like watering facilities, also brush management control, or even thinning. And then fencing is also some cost share and funding opportunities through the NRCS office that can get you well on your way to a silvopasture system. So what is not silvopasture? Obviously, we're not just releasing cattle in the woods or livestock in the woods and letting them go for months on end in the heat of the summer. That's not silvopasture. And it's not a single tree or several just different trees in the open pasture that obviously cattle can huddle around and congregate and not be very productive in the summer months. So it's really a highly managed system. There's two ways to establish silvopasture systems. So one is planting trees in open pasture, as that's a photograph of my landscape, actually. I have a small hobby farm in southern Minnesota in St. James. And here I planted chestnut trees. I've also had tree tubes, put tree tubes around them. And then 2 strands of hot wire to prevent the cattle that my son has grazing through them. And I've noticed if you don't have hot wire around these tree tubes, cattle will like to rub on things and basically rub these tree tubes if they're not protected with hot wire or other structural fences. And yeah, so you've got to protect these types of young trees in open pasture situations. Another way is what we're looking at, maybe more targeting in Minnesota, is our landowners that do have woodlands that do graze livestock and have a livestock operation that they release their livestock in the woods that they have. And you can thin existing woods and then plant maybe more forages, either cool season or warm season grasses and forbs that can be planted in that area that you like to establish in your landscape. So it's adding woods or trees to pasture or adding pasture to woods. And obviously we want to do this in a very sustainable manner and obviously highly managed environments with grazing livestock in these different types of settings. So silvopasture is an accepted practice usually in the Southeast and the Northwest. It's not widely accepted in the Midwest, but it's catching on, and Midwest farmers are adapting to these new practices. So there's silvopasture and hogs, chicken silvopasture actually with hazelnuts near the Twin Cities, and sheep can be silvopasture, goats, and goats are used for a lot of different things of invasive species control like buckthorn and so forth, but goats can be managed in a silvopasture system. And obviously all of these livestock operations need to be highly managed for the understory and obviously tree protection as well. So trees and pasture, obviously you do have to protect your trees if you have open pasture. Here you see the tree tube systems and then hot wire systems. That upper right-hand corner picture is my first couple years of establishing some chestnuts that I've had really small trees that were planted. I think I put chicken wire around them at first, and then obviously a hot wire around those little T-posts, the blue and red posts. And then you see the cattle in that narrow lane that is a highly grown over type area, and they've got a mouthful of grass there. But it's basically lanes that I have in my landscape, and it seems to work out well. They understand how to get in and get out and obviously not cross over the fence. There are some situations that you don't want to have silvopasture in your woodlands. If it's a deep shaded woods that you don't want to do any thinning, then you probably don't want to establish any silvopasture in that woodland. Also legal restrictions. If there's woods that have a legal restriction on grazing, then you don't want to do that. Obviously, if we have soils that are too wet or too steep of slopes, you don't want to establish a grazing system, a silvopasture system in that environment as well. Sensitive plants or wildlife, you may want to stay out of that area. If you have young trees that you want to keep and not fence, then you don't want to do a silvopasture program. And if you're not sure about grazing and not sure that you'll well manage the property and those particular fencing operations, then you don't want to get into silvopasture because it does take a well-managed and well type of supervised grazing type of plan. I just want to review some of the resources that are available. The National Agroforestry Center out of Lincoln, Nebraska is a great wealth of information for agroforestry. Free handouts for SWCD, NRCS, or anybody that wants to share information as a group. And they have silvopasture and all the 5 practices there in that website. Also, the Sustainable Farming Association is a great website. Tyler Carlson's put a lot of information on the website there, and he's established the Silvopasture Handbook and the Beginning Grazer Handbook as well, and those are available on their website. Savannah Institute is a very up-and-coming type of nonprofit that's a support of agroforestry practices and has a leaflet on all of the practices, and obviously have some pages on silvopasture as well. Propagate is a new kind of a spinoff of the Savannah Institute. So if you want to join into their newsletter, they get a newsletter out about every 2 weeks or so, or at least every month. Propagate Ventures is the name of that particular business, but they're in the regenerative agriculture and also silvopasture and agroforestry practices. Extension, our extension website covers all 5 practices of agroforestry as well as silvopasture, and we have a lot of information on our silvopasture website. Here's our management, our silvopasture manual for Minnesota, and it goes through seeding mixes and all kinds of things there that will be beneficial for you if you're just starting out. We do have a silvopasture learning network that we would like you to sign up for. We almost have 600 people signed up for this. So it's just silvopasture.umn.edu, and you can certainly access that when you, if you are interested in silvopasture, learning more about silvopasture. I think we send out a newsletter about every month. Something new is FarmMaps.umn.edu. Dean Current of Sinram at the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus have put this together with the support and use of staff at the Sustainable Farming Association. We have farmers that are talking to farmers, and this is a farmer educational program, peer-to-peer learning, and we have soil health cases, we have silvopasture cases, and we have snow fence cases on this type of a website, which is really cool. And they actually talk about in-depth practices, and you can learn more about each of their farms on that website. Here's Tyler's email address, and I'll type that in, and this is my email address as well. If you have questions about silvopasture, you can email us. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Matt, and then we're going to start Tyler's recorded presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary. As many of you noticed, Jeff Jackson has been putting in many of the links that Gary mentioned into the chat. So I do encourage you to have a look at those links if they're of interest to you. For now, we're going to switch over to a recording that we have available on YouTube. And the recording is, the full recording is a bit long. We're not going to play all of it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the first 2 minutes of it. And then you'll see me kind of switch ahead. So Tyler will do his introduction and kind of what he does in the first 2 minutes. And then we're going to switch ahead to him talking about silvopasture Minnesota, and then him talking about some specific examples from his farm in Sauk Center. And so you'll hear about some great things that he has ongoing, and really great photos too of all the different activities that Tyler's been a part of. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to YouTube. And you should all be seeing the screen now, and you should be hearing the audio. Again, I'll switch ahead at about 2 minutes in, and then we'll play the remaining video. And so in total, the video is about 35 minutes long. And so it should take us and give us plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So enjoy the video.
Good morning, everyone. And yeah, sorry I couldn't make it in person today, but I'm happy to be here to provide a little presentation about our farm and some of our silvopasture work. And also, you know, before I get to our farm, I'll provide some sort of a tour of silvopasture around the planet, really, and just sort of introduce that concept and practice. My name's Tyler Carlson. I've been farming in Sauk Center for about 10 years now, primarily raising grass-fed beef and lamb for direct sale to families and retail markets and some wholesale markets in the state of Minnesota. Our farm is in Sauk Center in Todd County, but near Sauk Center. We got 200 acres of land at the home farm and about another 45 acres of native grass that we're renting, with another 70 or 80 acres coming on this spring. We also have been raising some shrub fruit, honeyberries and sour cherries, mostly just kind of trial experimentation scale. We've got about 80 sour cherry shrubs and about 150 honeyberries. We've been growing them for 7 or 8 years now. And we're always experimenting with other perennials, some log grown shiitake mushrooms to make use of some of the wood thinnings from our forest systems, and starting to add asparagus, and we have interest in hazelnuts and perennial wheat. And for the last 2 years, just over 2 years, I've been working as a consultant for the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota as their Silvopasture and Agroforestry project lead. Pretty interesting. So again, just like bringing it back to Minnesota here, where and why might silvopasture be of use or value in Minnesota? The oak savannas and oak woodlands, historically would have been very fire dominated or dependent landscapes, and they would have had a lot of large mammal impact following along those fires, and attracted to the diversity of conditions, attracted to the shade, attracted to the diversity of plants. Certainly at different times of year would have found great forage resources there. Equally here, obviously the tallgrass aspen parklands, anywhere you've got kind of an understory that would have been an herbaceous dominated understory would have had historically substantial, large mammal impacts or activity and interactions, as well as probably fire. And those, so the grazing herbivores and the fire are interacting in various ways to maintain those complex ecosystems. And since we've lost most of the large herbivores outside of deer, I guess, ways in which we can reintroduce some of those grazing impacts, if we do it the right way, and we monitor what we're doing and we adapt our practices. I think that there's opportunities for silvopasture to be beneficial, ways of managing these systems. I just have here this open pine forest. In the work that I've been doing the last couple of years, just for my own research, I've come across some new things to me, just sort of as ecologist. I have come across some information that suggests that most of Eastern North America prior to colonization was actually much more of this open grown canopy with a very diverse herbaceous understory, largely pine and oak. Not just the oak savanna, not just the oak woodlands out here on the western edge of the eastern broadleaf forest, but in some assessments, more than 50% of the eastern broadleaf forest, all the way to the coast and down to the Gulf, would have been these open, old growth pine, old growth oak, various densities, various fire regimes, but largely managed by indigenous fire. Some probably just natural fire or whatever, and of course then the knock-on effects and the intertwined sort of effects of the grazing animals that would have gone with that. Here in Minnesota, again, I see the general. I guess I should go back. So I guess a question I have is, if the open pine forest and the open canopy forests of Eastern North America were something that was generated by people using fire, and there's a lot of complexity in those systems, is it possible for something like this to be regenerated even here in Minnesota? If a land manager decided they wanted something like this, it would be a novel forest type from a forest manager's perspective today, but I don't see a reason why this couldn't technically be recreated, or something novel be created with this type of management. Here we have these pine plantations now, poplar plantations. There's not a lot of diversity here, and if we thin these out, we can transition these systems to silvopasture, which maybe would be a better net present value, net economic return to an operator, to a land manager, and maybe we can get some even better ecological benefits out of the system by having some more diversity and having the animal, sort of the benefits of having livestock out on the land. If we get good management, I think that there's some opportunities here. There's, as I showed earlier, the Hoke orchards and the Main Street projects chicken and hazelnut thing, I'm seeing the interest in utilizing livestock integrated with fruit and nuts growing very quickly. There's a lot of complications with that because of the high value fruit and nut crop and the food safety concerns, but there's a lot of really innovative ways to bring livestock in for, some real good vegetation management benefits, as well as just like orchard hygiene, cleaning up the drops and mitigating some of the vectors and overwintering sort of resources for pests within those orchards. So there's a lot of interest there, and I see a lot of opportunity for that if we can be creative. Similarly with the Christmas tree plantation, this is something that's actually not that new. I've seen this in various sort of case studies across the country. It's not exactly common, but it's something that's been done, and sheep seem to do well with Christmas trees. And of course, we have Christmas tree plantations here, so this is an opportunity for some of those producers or someone wanting to get into that to think about that. So now to our farm and our practices and what we've been doing for the last 10 years. We've got really both systems, both ways of generating silvopasture we've been working with at Early Boots Farm. And so in 2012, we planted pines, both white and red pine, into what were old hay fields. In some cases, in one area, it was old cornfield. So right here on the left, this was a cornfield the year before. And so we've planted pasture and planted trees into this system. I'll get into that more a bit here in a minute. And then on the right, then we also worked with sort of existing oak dominated or historically oak dominated forest systems, and started to work with silvopasture the other way, which is sort of generally modifying the canopy of the forest and introducing forage and introducing livestock. And adaptive managed grazing, and just sort of observing what we see. So I'm just going to go through a quick tour of that. So planting trees out into fields on the left here, you can see it kind of gives you a sense of this is probably like 2 years in, 3 years into the planting. So trees were planted on double row north and south oriented pine plantation, basically plantation specs like 8 by 8 and 8 by 10 foot. Basically, so 8 feet between rows, and then 8 to 10 feet between trees within the row, and then 50 feet of open pasture before the next double row. So, 2 rows of trees, a large opening of an alley, and then 2 rows of trees, and just repeating that across the landscape. And then just using pretty cheap single strand, 14 gauge fence to just keep the livestock off of it. While I'm grazing those alleys in between, the trees are, being protected from the livestock. And then we have to bud cap the white pine to keep the deer from browsing the terminal lead bud on those trees. So they keep getting taller every year. And the mixture here in the pasture is probably about a 10-way mix of grasses and forbs and legumes. You can see on the right, we included chicory, which was fun to have for a few years. A lot of the field would turn, they get these bright purple flowers, and so none of these are natives, but they're cool season plants, which work well with silvopasture. The cool seasons do better under partial shade than warm seasons, and generally we have more accessible access to affordable cool season plant seeds and things like that. So like I mentioned, we have to protect the terminal bud with a bud cap, which is just a quarter sheet of a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper cut, just folded over and stapled over the top of that, which keeps the deer from browsing that top bud. And then we've had some issues, particularly in the red pine, with pocket gophers, so you got to kind of stay on top of that. But generally we're overplanting the site from what we would need as far as having the ultimate tree canopy. So way down the road, so we can lose some trees and it's fine. But when they start taking out a lot of trees in a row, you got to get on top of it. So just to be aware that there are things that can take out some pretty good sized trees. We've lost some, even like still now we're losing like 10 to 12 foot red pine to pocket gophers every once in a while. Just a little bit later photos. I think these are 2 years old now, maybe 3. So the trees are growing well. We haven't really been doing, there's a lot of recommendations about herbicide and mowing and tree mats and all this stuff for controlling the herbaceous vegetation around the trees. But I've found that they've been doing quite well for the most part, growing 2 to 3 feet a year, after that first year or so of getting established. We planted really large stock, the largest transplants that we could get from the state forest nursery. And we planted in 2012, which is a pretty dry year, and we didn't provide any supplemental water, and they did just fine. So planting really large trees is the largest tree that you can afford and can reasonably plant in a timely fashion is worth doing. Just some more, looks kind of more of a photo tour here of our use. Again, we're grazing the alleys in between the trees. Up there on the left is just cows grazing in the summer. And in the right there, top center, I guess, is just, I'm using, the trees have gotten large enough that I'm able to use them as a windbreak. So I've got, little windbreaks scattered all across the field that allows me to outwinter my livestock in a comfortable environment where they're out of the wind. And I can feed in the alleys. I can unroll hay bales in the alleys right next to those trees and keep them nice and comfortable in a setting where if the trees weren't there, they would be, I'd have some livestock performance issues just from, struggling with the cold. On the upper right, I just to show that I've started to, open up basically just a couple of the double rows to experiment with, can I start running animals into these trees, for a day, and will they survive? Obviously the livestock love to rub on the trees. They do like to browse the buds. But these trees, this was actually 2 years ago now, or maybe going on 3, that I had these just yearling cattle grazing in there. And trees are fine. So they've continued to grow just fine. They've been kind of browsed or rubbed, kind of limbed up. Their bottom branches have been kind of broken off and whatnot, but the trees have been okay. They've survived that and keep growing well. The bottom right there is the next year, I guess. You can see they're greened out and happy. Bottom left, there's just another photo, just kind of generally giving a bigger sense of the, north-south rows of trees with 50-foot spacing in between, and livestock grazing in the alleys until the trees get larger. We've started grazing sheep. I guess I've got a photo at the end of this to show that, but we've started grazing lambs into the trees pretty consistently, in some of the red pine especially. And this spring I intend to put them in the white pine. So trees are big enough to handle the yearlings from what I can tell. So they're definitely able to handle the lambs. They can only reach so high, and we move animals pretty frequently, so they don't get access to trees for very long. They're never in an area for more than a day and a half before they move on, and they don't come back for oftentimes 40 to 60 days between grazing events. This last year, we had a volunteer event on the farm as part of one of our grants, where we have been doing some oak savanna, Silvopasture and oak savanna work, and we decided to plant white oak, burr end white oak, into our pine silvopastures as kind of a transitional crop. So the pine will serve as kind of an initial crop, and over the years after thinning and eventual harvest of those mature trees, instead of having nothing left behind tree wise, we'll have hopefully some 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old white oak ready to take over the site and be ready to continue that silvopasture kind of in a new direction, kind of allowing us an opportunity to maybe move the site towards an oak savanna restoration in these old fields with well-established trees. So the other way that we've been working with silvopasture, when I started farming, I would walk through our woods, and it was honestly hard to kind of even get around in there. There was buckthorn coming in, a lot of native trees too that were coming in that were just really thick, and it was hard to get in and use the site. It was hard to even just walk around. And I noticed that, we have these very, very large, 200-year-old, give or take, bur oaks that clearly were at one time growing in an open environment, full sun, no competition environment. They're very short trees, generally speaking, but they're very large trunks with big branches that stretch out, down towards the ground. And some of those lower branches have since died with the shade that's been, brought in over the last really probably mostly 50 years or so. Most of the trees that are not the large oaks are around 50 years or younger. There's occasionally, a patch of some trees that are a little bit older, but not much. And there's basically zero oak regeneration in that site. And I looked around and I said, okay, well, I've got some elm over here that, are dying. It's the last of the elms. They're dying from Dutch elm. And I've got a bunch of ash in here. And I like ash trees, but the emerald ash borer is coming and is nearby. So when that goes, I guess I'm left with black cherry, which doesn't actually seem to like it here that much. They get to be tall and fairly mature, but then they die kind of young. They don't get really big. They seem to be sort of earlier, more of an early successional tree, and they don't seem to have a long range component here, and they don't produce much, as far as a long range valuable crop. And they, like I said, they tend to deal with a lot of disease issues. So then I'm left with aspen and ironwood, and coming in the understory is a lot of buckthorn. There's some box elder and things here and there, but I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, if I don't get oaks regenerated here, what is this forest going to look like in 30 or 40 years or 50 years or whenever these oak trees die? If there's no oak trees coming in, I think I'm going to be left with like buckthorn and maybe aspen and box elder if I'm lucky, maybe some cherry here and there, but altogether a very, very different forest type, and I would say ecologically less valuable, substantially less valuable. Maybe not, but I think that, yeah, it's a forest that I was much less interested in, and I wanted to get oak regeneration. And I knew that, yeah, like the history, of oak savanna would have involved bison and elk and fire and all these other things. And it just seemed like we needed to reintroduce some of that to the system. And so I started just slowly thinning in patches. I didn't do all at once. I just did kind of little half acre here and there, and then introduced our livestock, and basically was grazing twice. I was moving twice a day, so they'd get an area for about 12 hours and then I'd move on, and then they wouldn't come back for about a year. So I was very, very cautious when I first started doing this, knowing that livestock could be too heavy-handed of a tool and their impacts could be deleterious pretty quickly. I'd seen obviously a lot of bad impacts, bad outcomes in my judgment from livestock in the woods over the years. But so I started to introduce some of these management practices with livestock, and starting to open up the canopy and learn how different light coming in and livestock impact was interacting, and how that was impacting just from observation, what that was doing to the soil, what that was doing to the plant community, how the livestock seemed. Were they happy? Were they comfortable? Were they getting enough forage? Were they doing well? Were they gaining well? Was their body condition and coat telling me that they were healthy? So just kind of slowly opening things up and experimenting, just kind of farm scale experimenting, and was really pleased with the results. At first, I was just opening up really probably to about a 35% sunlight, which is, we're really targeting 50% for your cool season forages. If you want to do natives and a true, more true warm season oak savanna habitat restoration, you're probably looking at 75, 80, 85% sunlight is a target, sort of metric. And I just started opening up towards that 50%, but in kind of a two-step. So I opened up partway, just enough to get, basically, I found, to be able to get forage established and get a lot more light to the floor to grow a more herbaceous understory and have something for the livestock to work with. And then I've come back and thinned again towards that 50% level. So here's just photos showing spring green up. The leaves you can see on the trees are not fully leafed out. They're they're really kind of halfway from bud break to full leaf, and we've got a lot of forage underneath. I don't have a good photo here showing kind of the contrast for this site, but if you go about 200 feet to the northwest of where this photo was taken, you can see where I haven't done any thinning and opening up, and there's basically nothing growing on the floor underneath there. It's so shaded by ironwood and aspen and things that there's almost nothing growing in the spring. And so this just shows you how lush, I've really changed sort of the amount of light getting into the floor, and really what kind of plants are establishing and maintaining themselves throughout the year. It's really, I've introduced orchard grass and red clover, again, non-natives, but I've found that they have played fairly well with the native plants that are in the system now. Orchard grass is a bunch grass, so it has less of a sort of tendency to sort of spread and form a dense sod that takes over and just sort of like a brome grass or a bluegrass or Reed's canary grass, which can just kind of dominate a site. And yeah, so it's really kind of a lot of grass, a little bit of brush, some saplings, some invade, like we cut down the buckthorn and that's been resprouting, but the cattle have been kind of grazing it and keeping it down. It's not killing it, but they've been keeping it down a little bit. So it's been, fairly diverse understory here. You can see a lot of woodland ephemeral plants, much more shade loving ephemeral spring plants, that I'm maintaining while having this, flush of additional native plants that otherwise weren't really there before. And I've got this red clover and orchard grass coming in, mixing in with all of this. And like you can see on the lower right here, the buckthorn is resprouted, but this is probably 4 years after I started, and I'm really 10 years in and I'm still seeing this in my understory. So even with the grazing that we've been doing, I've been able to maintain a pretty interesting plant community. The buckthorn has been kept down to where it's so far I've only got a few plants that have gotten back to where they're starting to produce new flowers and new seeds, and so we're going to start treating those areas, but otherwise it's just been adding to my forage base. Again, you can see on the left there some it's Jack in the Pulpit. We've got a lot of these, very interesting spring plants. Ramps have been actually thriving in this system. In this part of the woods, I didn't really see ramps here before. We've got other areas near the yard where we have a lot of ramps, and we do some wild harvesting of ramps. And now I've got ramps spreading on their own with the livestock introduction and the more light too, perhaps. I'm not really sure what ramps ideally like, but I'm seeing a lot more ramps in this part of the woods. Again, on the left there is an example of our forage. It's kind of more of a, pasture dream forage base, really nice mix of, legumes and grass mixed together there, kind of dense, so that's the kind of forage that makes cows and sheep really happy. They can get a nice big mouthful of grass and legumes that's high digestibility, good quality, and fill themselves up quick and go lay down and just sort of relax and chew their cud. And that's what leads to high animal performance. We want animals to quickly be able to fill their guts with high quality forage and then go lay down and relax. And that's good for them. They're happy, and it's best for us too. It's best for our bottom line and our production metrics. And since having done this, it's the introduction of both livestock, and a certain, probably the certain type of grazing that we're doing, and the additional light that we brought in. But we're getting a lot of oak regen, especially after a big mast year. I've got thousands and thousands of oak seedlings, like per square, I don't know, like per square yard or something like that. They just blanket the floor. This is really just probably 2 years afterwards, just showing some of, and they don't all make it, of course. There's a lot of voles and rabbits and deer and everything in the woods and things too, but we're getting the regen at least, and some of them are advancing. Some of them are surviving and making it, for a few years, and I'm starting to protect some of them, as you can see here. Just showing what I'm doing with some fencing, just like my basic fencing stuff. I'm just putting single wires, strands of hot wire around poly wire, which is usually not hot, but then when I'm around it with the livestock, I run my lead and back wires, past these little plots where I'm protecting the trees. So here, this is more of this spring sort of volunteer day on the right there, using tree tubes and tree mats. And so we put those tubes over some small, probably 1 or 2 year old oak saplings or seedlings, or actually we planted there. We planted some of the leftovers that we had, but in other areas, I'm just protecting trees that have, you know, naturally established themselves, and just trying to keep the deer and the livestock off of them. I don't find the cows do too much, but I think the deer and the rabbits and the voles are pretty hard on those. So just trying to give a little bit of a helping hand for that future oak community. And the quicker, I found that tree tubes are pretty good. I don't know if I have a photo here, probably not. Just another photo here of this is a site that's in process of moving more towards an oak savanna. We've seeded this with a pretty high diversity of native grasses and forbs last spring. And so I've got to open this up more. There's not enough light, but I think there's enough light here to get it established. We got good take last summer, even with the drought. We got good establishment of the grasses, and I just need to get more light in here. So I keep working away at this, hoping to get towards an oak savanna there, just to kind of an experimental 1.5 acre plot there within the woods. There's just some photos here of the livestock kind of in action. You can see this sort of dappled shade. There are areas on the edges and different times of the day where it's full sun, you know, like not every plant is in like perfect 50% shade or something. It's kind of moving. It's a dappled shade. The shade conditions are moving throughout the day, but we produce quite a lot of forage in these sites, considering how much shade's being, you know, let down. But and we let the plants get pretty tall. You know, I early boot, you know, our farm's name is an homage, I guess, to the boot stage of grass development. And so it's just before the plant is really about to expose its seed head. It's transitioning from vegetation to reproductive, you know, growth, and it's going to put its seed head out. And so we want to let that plant basically get as much, we want to maximize the vegetative growth, and we want to maximize the roots that those plants are able to put down, the amount of energy that they're able to store under the ground, the depth they're able to reach, the carbon they're able to put there, the nutrients they're able to access. And so generally we're looking to graze pretty tall. And that, you know, is actually pretty good for cattle as far as the forage sort of quality and quantity. And it's obviously all those metrics I just mentioned about the soil and water. Yeah, it's also, you know, kind of a landscape that provides a lot more structure as far as like birds and mammals, you know, habitat wise, you know, and then we move on, you know, and then the landscape gets to rest and, you know, provide those services, those ecological services when the livestock are gone. Just again here, just showing kind of some examples of before and after grazing here. These are actually some pretty, like, you can see the shrubs are pretty thick in this one area. I've got 1 acre where the buckthorn's coming in kind of thick. And so we're going to use goats to hammer that this spring, and maybe some brush mowing. But again, just showing the sort of like 12-hour before and after graze. And then, yeah, they don't come back. I've started grazing since I've opened it up more. We're back twice a year, oftentimes. Sometimes still it's once a year, just depending on conditions. I don't go in the woods when it's really wet. The soil is really high quality here, and I'm just overly cautious about compaction and things. So, you know, I adapt my management, and I'm very, you know, we're shifting things all the time in how when we're grazing, where we're grazing, which direction we're going, how long we're in there, just based on conditions and that sort of thing. This is just showing the amount of forage that can be produced in these sites. I mean, this is pretty tall orchard grass in the upper left. You can see here on the right, this one orchard grass plant is, you know, the leaves are, if I pull them up straight, are reaching up to my pocket. Lower left there, you can just get a sense of the density. You know, there's a lot of shade there in this photo, but I mean, there's a lot of density of grass. There's a lot of tonnage within these systems. And the lower right is just highlighting this buckthorn that is like, just after 10 years gotten to the point after cutting it that I have to go back and deal with it, because it's about 10 feet tall again, maybe 8 feet tall. So we're going to use goats. Like I said, we're going to use goats and other tools to try and work that back. Here's just some kind of comparative photos from this last summer's drought. The upper left is our open field pastures. You know, we've got about 45 or 60 acres that are, you know, open pasture, no trees. and they pretty much heat stressed and went, dormant. The seed heads came out in, I mean, it was early July, early June, maybe even late May. Some of those plants were already putting their seed heads out of heat stress, and you can see a lot of space between plants, bare soil, and yeah, just the amount of heat and sun that we had early in the year just basically shut these entire systems down. Between April, first week of April and last week of July, we had about 1.5 inches of rain and a lot of 90-degree days very early in the year. And I think we got about 10% of our normal growth from these pastures over that time frame. On the right hand side there, upper right, is just a photo of the sheep kind of grazing in some of our red pine silvopasture in one spot, and you can just see again the drought stress in those pastures. And the trees here, they're not really big enough to do enough with their shade to really modify that microclimate much. The sheep can go in and find the shade and kind of lay down in it right there, which is good for them, but the trees aren't doing a whole lot for the forage base and the soil necessarily at that point. But in the more established systems where we've been working with the wooded sites, you can see here in the lower left, these large open grown oak trees, and all the forage that was still produced here. So a little bit of shade went a long ways to modifying the microclimate for the soil and the forage there. And we were able to produce probably more like 60 to 70% of our total, average normal forage production in these systems. Like I said, relative to what was probably about 10% or so in the open systems. So these established silvopasture systems really like outperformed or relatively outperformed this last summer during a hot and dry period. And we were able to graze, we were able to keep grazing with very, very little hay feeding out to about mid-August this year, when most people were feeding in June. And that's because of our silvopasture. It's because of some of our practice. It's a lot of it's because of our regenerative grazing practices. We made a lot of good decisions about how we graze that open ground so that it would still be ready when the rains returned. And thankfully, the rains did return in August. And we were able to grow a lot of forage in that open ground. And as a result, we were able to keep from really selling any cattle this last summer, when a lot of operations liquidated a lot of their herd or all of their herd due to the drought. So, it was still a really hard year, but we were able to survive it. And I attribute that to silvopasture and our grazing practices, where we're grazing tall and we're grazing with a lot of time in between grazing events. And yeah. So with this work, the last couple of years, we've produced a lot of different resources from both, fact sheets and resource manuals and how-to, documents that you can look up, PDFs here on our website. There's a lot of webinars, there's some podcasts. We've had a ton of field days and workshops. More of those are coming this summer. So if this is something you're interested in, watch, sign up to be an SFA member, and check out the Silvopasture Learning Network. Sign up for that, and you'll get updates on when those field days and things are. And yeah, I guess I'll mostly leave it there. I will say that I think that there's a lot of wooded. I know that obviously I'm aware of the negative impacts of livestock in forested systems over the last number of decades. And there's a lot of sites that livestock don't belong in. Probably like maple basswood just shouldn't. I mean, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's really challenging. And I'd say we should hold off until we're like masters at the rest of this. But I think there's a lot of interest in this right now. And I think that, we've got, according to one survey, over 600,000 acres of grazed woodlands in Minnesota alone right now. And that's largely, almost exclusively unmanaged grazing. So, if the livestock are going to be in there, then let's manage them, and let's try to work with producers to improve the outcomes on those sites. Let's get creative and look at, for the producers who really want to get, their management at a top level for habitat restoration. Let's work with people to do, you know, some oak savanna, oak woodland restoration on their sites. It's better than it turning into buckthorn. Let's work with the sites that are already in buckthorn and try to work with goats and find ways to improve the ecological outcomes there. And yeah, let's look towards plantations and orchards and things, ways we can, let's get creative and find ways that we can get trees out into places where there aren't trees. And I think Silvopasture offers a really good option for that. It keeps it in production, and I think it's something that's attractive to a lot of landowners who aren't interested in maybe just planting it to trees, whether that's a plantation or just sort of a reforestation type approach. I think Silvopasture is something that people are really interested in, and a lot of landowners are across the state. So, you know, I think this is a good way to meet people where they're at and get some really good outcomes for producers, but also for the land and water and climate, especially where we're adding trees to pasture where there aren't any now. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, Tyler did a great job on that recording, and we're going to use that in our extension website and also posted in the SFA website as well. I know there's been some questions in chat, and we can address that. And what maybe you wanted to, I think Troy Salzer is a part of our group here too. He's an extension educator up in northern Minnesota and also does Silvopasture with his cattle. Do you want to help address that, Troy? You want to unmute yourself about nutrient management? And again, we don't have Tyler Carlson couldn't be with us today, but we recorded that recording.
Gary, this is Troy. If you could do me a favor and actually repeat the question, because I am driving and I cannot be looking at.
Yep. So the question was, Shane, let's see, how does nutrient management jive with Silvopasture? Any big changes to how you would normally manage a pasture?
So in relationship to this, generally speaking, most pastures that are being managed for Silvopasture aren't necessarily being looked at as being maximum sort of production. They're trying to capture the ability of the grass that is growing there naturally without a lot of supplementation, fertilizers and such. I think Tyler did a nice job addressing some of the introductions of other species of that can be added, such as a legume species to naturally mix nitrogen, orchard grass that is naturally more productive, but not necessarily going in there and having to add a lot of additional nutrient under there. The other key that I didn't hear Tyler specifically address, but I think it's critical, is as we manage these pastures, having adequate shade uniformly across the pasture is beneficial, so that the animals don't congregate just strictly in one area, concentrating the nutrients from areas of grass and actually moving that nutrient to other parts of the pasture. We want them to fairly uniformly deposit the nutrients where they consume the forage to the best of the ability. And that really shows for good reason to manage the animals as was recommended.
Great. Thank you, Troy, for those comments. Appreciate it. And yeah, he mentioned the shading kind of moves around, but yes, I think in his operation, most of it is pretty consistent and not just one area that's open to sunlight and then obviously the rest is shade. But Michael asked about carbon credits. Have applying for carbon credits on suitable agroforestry forests has been researched. You know, carbon credits is new, and maybe Matt can address this too. He's been working with carbon credits. Yes, in the past, in 2008, 2010, there was Chicago climate change. A lot of CRP was eligible for carbon credits back then. I'm not sure about the forested parts of agroforestry practices, but I would think that they could. They're looking for larger acreages, obviously, of agroforestry or forested type landscapes for carbon credits, but there might be some opportunities that some of these landscapes that are put into agroforestry systems that are treed that could qualify for some of these credits down the road. They're fairly new, Michael, if you're looking at those. Matt's got actually a Fridays with a Forester taping of carbon credits, if you haven't watched his presentation, and that's good. So we'll have to look at that, and we'll have to see if agroforestry plantings can qualify for carbon credits for our landowners. Matt, you want to have any comments for that?
Yeah, and not much to add, Gary. I think you did a great summary of it. I think, we in Extension, I'll post a link in the chat, have a lot of resources on carbon in forests and woodlands. We haven't done much, in these agroforestry settings. I still think, there's a big push for reaching smaller landowners with a lot of the emerging carbon credits, both for forests and for farmers. And so I don't see any reason why, if you had a silvopasture system like this, why it couldn't be included in a carbon market program for forests, as long as you have the density. I think, these are mostly kind of lower density, more sun hitting the forest floor. You might have to ask, what is the definition of a forest that carbon program has? I think many of these systems would meet that definition of a forest, but I'll post a link in chat with some more resources for you on that question.
Yeah, and Carol has a question here. My partner and I are currently reworking our woods area, cleaning out buckthorn and most of the prickly ash and currants. We plan to replant diverse tree and shrub varieties along with some good grasses and forbs. We do not have the kind of grazers, any kind of grazers. Do you think that mowing, let's see, do you think we would need to mow occasionally? I'd say yes, probably. You want to watch for your invasive species, certainly. But yeah, you might have a neighboring livestock person that might want to bring over some livestock every now and then to use your landscape as a pasture area or silvopasture area. So you can consider that, Carol. But yeah, it sounds like you're doing great work in your landscape, and good luck and in managing your new landscape in woods and thinning them down. Anybody else want to comment, Jeff or Matt or even Troy, on that? Let's see, any other questions? Let's see, Jay Larson. I have a small parcel in northeast Minnesota of mostly aspen. Had been logged 20 years ago, and I will be taking some down to add diversity and bring back to health. Let's see, my neighbors are getting Nordic sheep. Would there be an opportunity to graze them and still work toward diversity? Yes, I think there'd be an opportunity. Possible opportunities, issues. Certainly you want to look at the sheep will graze obviously lower than some of our cattle and so forth. They will eat most anything. They may not eat the oaks as much as the other vegetation that you might have out there. But certainly if you've got some regen plants that you want to protect, you may have to certainly look at protecting those particular plants either by fencing or some type of a individual tree type protection, which can be costly. You can email Tyler or myself on that question if you like, Jay Larson. Any other questions you might have? You can certainly unmute yourself if you like.
Gary, this is Troy Salter. I've done a fair amount of this. And
Okay.
my recommendation in relationship to this is to actually go ahead and utilize the livestock if possible. And in that process, sheep, even though they are sheep, you can go ahead and drop the trees down, and the cattle will consume, or the sheep will consume those leaves off of the popple tree. That is fairly common to do. And then as they will regrow, the trees will produce a nice material that they will also continue to graze as part of that mix.
Super. Thanks, Troy. I know a lot of terminology in silvopasture is called fodder now. And actually people are planting willows and other deciduous trees in even pastures, even for just grazing livestock. So livestock would eat them and then they grow back from the root system. Kind of interesting. Thank you for mentioning that, Troy. Any other question we have? We need to close it down pretty soon. We thank everybody for joining us today. And if you do have questions, our email and emails are available on that chat.
And Gary, I think I've got a couple of closing slides if there are no more questions.
Yes, sure.
So again, yeah, like Gary said, thanks for joining us. I'll skip ahead a bit. As a reminder, Gary's email is there. I think he posted it in chat as well. Again, Tyler Carlson, his information is there as well. I did post a link in the chat to the full video of Tyler. It's about 48 minutes, that entire video. He covered some things that Gary talked about and some of the things that we didn't see. So if you do want to see the full video or just kind of go back to it, you can find that link there in the chat. And then again, a quick reminder, we've got 2 other webinars that are part of this series this spring. Angie Gupta, a member of our Extension Forestry team, will be talking in 2 weeks about family-friendly earth care. And then on May 27th, we have a couple of DNR foresters joining us. Troy Holcomb and Amber Jungworth will be joining us there later this month or later in May. A quick reminder, there will be an evaluation when you close Zoom. Something should appear in your web browser. We encourage you to fill that out. Please share comments about today's webinar and also any future webinars you'd like to see. I think as a part of this series, we're always looking for new topics that people are interested in. And a reminder that survey is anonymous. And so we do appreciate your candid feedback on how the webinar went and what you're interested in learning about. And then that wraps it up. A couple of links there. The My Minnesota Woods website is really our go-to resource for a lot of things related to trees and woodlands in Minnesota. So you can find that at z.umn.edu/myminwoods. And then if you don't get our My Minnesota Woods email, we send that on the second Tuesday of every month with a lot of tips and tricks for different things you might do as a property owner or a landowner. And that's z.umn.edu/mmw email. And then a link I posted in the chat. If you wanted to look back at this recording, we'll have that posted in a few days. Or if you wanted to look back at any other of the videos and the recordings posted in this series, you can find them at z.umn.edu/Fridays. And so that does it for us. Thanks for hanging on for a few extra minutes here this morning. Have a great Arbor Day. And then Gary, thanks again for your presentation. And thanks, Tyler. And we'll see you soon.
Troy, thanks so much for adding to today's presentation.
No problem, Gary. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part. Thank you.
Yep, appreciate it. Yep, later. Man, good job. I don't know if Jeff's still on or not.